Hello, and welcome to Paul's Thorn, a podcast that explores disability in the Bible, its stories, meanings, and impact on faith, with the goal of examining how Scripture portrays disability, challenge common interpretations, and offer fresh theological insights. My name is Angela Vincent, and thank you for joining me today. So it's been a while. I guess it's been about a month since the last episode went out. I know it was a pretty busy month for a lot of that. I went to go visit family in Texas, and then right after that had to make a very quick turnaround and head to Florida for a conference. It was a lot of excitement. It was great to see family, so that part was very nice. The conference was very interesting. The only thing that was making me a little bit nervous, at least until I got to Florida, was the logistics of making sure that I got back from Texas in time to essentially leave the next day for Florida. And so once I was there, then I was able to relax a little bit and just enjoy it. So when I came back from that, right away, I actually had my final that was due for my class. And so it was very much a whirlwind for a few weeks. And so once that final was done, then I had a couple weeks left, 2 weeks left before work finally let out. Then finally, after all that excitement, an opportunity to have a little more calm. It turns out, I guess, the last week of work, and not necessarily because of work, but the last week before I headed out on vacation for 2 weeks, turned out to be a little more exciting than I had thought it would be, in that we ended up having a pretty bad windstorm. I'm up in Washington State, and so it's actually been pretty wet here for the last few weeks, which is not unusual. Most of the winter it rains constantly. It rains all the time, but it rains extra in the winter times, and so we'll start having a lot of standing water around our property, or just go for days and days where it doesn't feel like you see the sun. And so we're kind of entering that period, but it's been extra again this year. And so there's been a lot of flooding. We're safe from the flooding, so that's been a blessing, but we are not necessarily safe from some of the wind. And so I guess maybe it was Monday or Tuesday, we had a terrible windstorm, and so I woke up after midnight with the house just shaking. It's about the worst I ever remember the wind being here, and worried about all the cracks and poppings because we have a lot of trees around the property. And that's a bad thing when it's been raining so much, as the ground becomes saturated, and it's not unusual or uncommon for trees to just literally fall over, roots and all. And so when the wind starts going in that situation, it's a little bit scary, wondering if a tree's going to fall down and hit the house. That did not happen, though we did lose a tree the week before, I guess, in another windstorm. It's a very windy season for us, too, in winter. But we did end up having the power go out that night and basically spent the next 2 days without power. So that was a bit of a challenge. We do have a generator, so that at least we'll get electricity, but we don't get any Wi-Fi. And what's actually the worst part of it is we're in a water association that's on well water. And so they've made the decision for financial reasons, some might argue they were being cheap, to not put a generator on the tank. And so for those of us who were at the top of the hill, it ended up being basically a gravity-fed water system. For those of us at the top of the hill, once the power goes out, then the water pressure drops significantly. And so that becomes, the longer it goes on, it gets a little bit scary. You have to start making kind of some hard decisions. For example, flushing, not to be TMI, but flushing becomes something that you can't do very much. So you have to make some choices about that. Drinking water becomes scary. Actually, I think that mostly the only drinking water we had was what we used for coffee for those few days, and I was drinking canned seltzer for a lot of it, again, because the water pressure was so low. Showering becomes another out of the question thing. So it just, the longer it goes on, the harder and harder it gets. So I spent most of those, I guess it was 40 hours, basically stalking the electricity company's site to see when they're going to be fixing the power. I think it was 45,000 people were out that first night. And so I'd go back constantly. They promised us it would be done by 4 p.m. that first day, and then 4 p.m. came and went, and we still didn't have any power. So then about 4:30 or so, we got an email saying that they'd reassessed that they didn't have an estimate, and they were still working on it. So it'd be about another 24 hours after that before we finally did get power again. It made for a difficult few days. especially, again, going into the last week of work and wanting that to go fairly smoothly. That wasn't really, I guess, what was going to happen. So I'm glad that's over with. Every time now we get a windstorm, and it's actually windy right now, I start thinking, oh my gosh, I hope this doesn't happen again, especially now that I'm on vacation. So I alluded to that before. I'm actually on vacation now for 2 weeks. And this is one of my favorite, well, I guess, other than, seeing family, this is my favorite time of the year, not just because of Christmas, but because I get to spend some time here at home. So usually when I have like the big projects like reorganizing the house or decorating stuff, or if I have to go clean out a closet, then it usually is safe for this period. So I spend the 2 weeks puttering around the house. So to me, that's very fulfilling and a lot of fun. I look forward to this every single year. One part of it I don't look forward to, though, is that every year now, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, I've spent this period also doing an Epidex or chemo cream treatment. So I guess I have a lot of sun damage from growing up in West Texas in the 70s, before we really thought too much about sunscreen or the importance of it. I would argue maybe we actually went the other way, where we put on baby oil to try to get a better tan. But because of that period, I do again have a lot of sun damage that has started to pop up as I've gotten older. And so nothing serious in comparison to some of the more hardcore, I guess, skin cancers. But I have a lot of tendency towards basal cell carcinoma. And so when I got my first spot on my face, the doctor told me, well, nobody wants cancer, but if you have to get cancer, then I made the right choice. In that basal cell is pretty much environmentally based only. It's not something that's genetic, and it's fairly easy to treat, and that it's also something that is very slow to grow, and that it also is very rare for it to metastasize. And so that combination means that, again, of all kinds of cancers one could get, this is a pretty decent one to get. But so what I have to do then every year at Christmas, since that's the only time of year where I have that kind of block of time to take care of myself, is I put on this cream twice a day for the 2 weeks. And then it takes about a week after for it to heal enough for me to be out in public again. It's actually pretty slick the way it works. You put this cream on. When you put it on, it causes an autoimmune reaction in your body. And so then your body starts to basically attack the cancer cells that are present and kill them, and then essentially pushes it out your skin. And so it's only good for cancers that are pretty surface level, but it's pretty effective. The only thing is, it looks pretty bad. Like when I put it on my face, I'll end up looking very red and gross for, again, it's about a 3-week process of looking like a witch, is how I always talk about it. But when it's all said and done, then your face looks a little bit pink in the spots that apparently had cancer, but you're essentially cancer-free. And so it looks a little bit, I guess, like getting a chemical peel as far as being refreshed afterwards, because your skin actually does look better. You've gotten rid of the sun damage associated with it. And so this is my 3-week period of self-care / cancer treatment that I do every year. It's not a super painful process. It's more just time-consuming. But again, afterwards, you're cancer-free. And you also, look a little bit skin refreshed. So that's kind of, if you have a little vanity like I do, that's always nice to kind of look a little nicer after the process. So with that, I guess I'll get started on the actual episode. And so this is Paul's Thorn, episode 15, entitled Making Room at the Inn, Accessibility and the Spirit of Christmas. Christmas is a season of welcome, of making room for Christ, for one another, and for the stranger. Yet for many people with disabilities, even sacred celebrations meant to embody the Spirit have often been physically or socially inaccessible. The story of Christmas begins with the phrase, "There was no room for them in the inn." This is from Luke 2:7. So that verse doesn't just describe Mary and Joseph's situation. It's a reflection of how the world often treats people who don't fit its structures. But the beauty of the Christmas story is that God chose to enter precisely where there was no room, transforming a stable into a sanctuary. In the same way, accessibility is not just a checklist, it's a form of incarnation, a way to make Christian love tangible in our spaces and traditions. The Bible reminds us that true worship isn't about perfect holiday performances or the decorations that we use in our house or the beauty of the building that we worship in. It's about creating belonging. As we learn in Romans 15:7, welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. So to start, accessibility can be seen as part of the incarnation. So in the Christian tradition, the incarnation is the ultimate act of God becoming accessible to us. God, in the person of Jesus, didn't stay distant, transcendent, or aloof. Instead, he took on our human form, lived among us, and entered into all the struggles, pain, and limitations of our world. Accessibility on God's part can be seen as vulnerability. Christ didn't just appear as a transcendent being or in a way that would have been convenient or comfortable for the divine. He came as a vulnerable child, born in a manger in an ordinary family without status or power. The incarnation itself can be understood as an act of radical accessibility, meeting humanity where we are rather than asking us to change to meet God. It's also interesting to note that God came to us in the messiness of life. So accessibility at Christmas and in the church year-round can reflect this idea of God with us in this messiness and complexity that we see in the human experience. Whether it's physical accessibility, emotional accessibility, or sensory, the invitation to belong is an extension of the incarnation itself. Christ didn't wait for us to become perfect before he came, and churches that practice accessibility mirror that openness, allowing people to engage with God and community where they are without needing to change or to be fixed first. Again, the incarnation was God making the divine self reachable. From John 1:14, we learn that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. In disability theology, accessibility is not charity, it's a spiritual practice. It's how we participate in the same movement of the incarnation. We make community and love real in our spaces. Accessibility isn't about accommodation, it's about belonging. It's about saying you are already part of the story. So to provide some historical and traditional background to accessibility, we do know there's different ways that a church has been accessible over the years. So in the early church, for example, many Christian communities actually worshiped inside homes. So then accessibility was natural there because everyone contributed and gathered in this shared simple space. But as Christianity became institutionalized, worship moved into large ornate cathedrals that often prioritized aesthetics over access. Stairs, narrow pews, and acoustics for choirs, not for understanding, became the norm. This tends to mirror broader social shifts in that the more the church sought out grandeur, the more it sometimes lost touch with those on the margins, including people with disabilities. So then during the medieval and Renaissance period of Christian worship, there were some instances where you would have a little more accessibility in that, for example, with nativity plays and pageants in the Middle Ages, these were often performed outdoors, so they were accessible to most of the townspeople. Some towns even allowed people with visible disability to play certain roles, often shepherds or beggars. Now, when I say that, I can also see where that could be a negative thing, maybe. I guess it could be construed both ways. For example, if they only allowed little people to play certain parts, that might not be as warm and inviting, I guess, as it could. So again, though that idea, again, is not perfect, these plays and having them accessible to everyone meant that they were at least visibly including disability in the retelling of the birth of Christ. You can also think of disability as part of caroling traditions. So when people were involved in caroling, by going from house to house, they were also including then folks who maybe were homebound and were not able to attend church. I know that a lot of churches I've been to, being homebound is something that's not unusual, especially for older members of the congregation. And so, again, being able to bring the experience to those folks is very beneficial. A singer specifically went to the sick or elderly who couldn't attend Mass. And so that's an early example, again, of bringing the celebration to those who could not come to it. So another fairly well-known story, I guess, of accessibility, if you want to think of it that way, is the story behind Silent Night, the hymn. So in 1818, in the small Austrian town of Obendorf, the church organ broke on Christmas Eve. So unable to use the grand instrument, Father Joseph Moore and composer Franz Gruber adapted the song to one with a simple guitar. Their adaptation, born from limitation, became one of the most beloved hymns of all time. Accessibility often begins with creative adaptation. What was once seen as limitation can birth something timeless and beautiful. So then in more recent years, we've seen things that really open up the church for other folks as well. For example, Braille hymnals, which allowed blind Christians to fully participate in Christmas worship. Also with the inclusion of ASL in churches and signed liturgies. Then deaf congregations could begin translating Christmas services into sign language, expanding the concept of joy to the world. Other different innovations that have been helpful in bringing accessibility into the church have been around mobility and assistive devices. So after World War II, many churches in the U.S. began to add ramps and widen doors, often in response to returning disabled veterans. This shift subtly transformed Christmas gatherings, allowing more people to join the celebration. So then, what are some modern examples of accessibility in churches? So the first one, and again, this is one that's near and dear to my heart, has to do with sensory and autism accessibility. So some churches have started to adopt the idea of a sensory-friendly Christmas Eve service or Christmas service. So this is part of a wider movement, I guess, to have more autism accessible services in general. And so in church, how this could basically look would be, for example, you could have a shortened liturgy. So instead of most churches typically, or at least the ones I've been to, are about an hour to an hour and a half. So if they were to cut it down to, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes, it might make it easier for someone who had a lot of sensory impact to make it through the service, essentially. The house lights maybe could be, I guess, stay on as opposed to get dark. I know some church services darken them, especially if they're, doing like having a lot of candlelight. But that can be a little, well, it's an interesting one because some autistic people react to having the overhead lights on too much, and some might react to having it too dark. And so I guess it's more being open to knowing that the lights may have to be adjusted somewhat to be accessible to the members of that congregation. Ironically enough, I just talked about the candlelight. I guess some ways they could be accessible friendly, or autism accessible friendly, is to not do the candle lighting. I don't myself have any issues with candlelight in general. I would actually prefer things being darker than too much light, depending on the situation. But I can see where somebody might have some concern about that. Other ways that they could go about being accessible would be to have no surprise music swells. Loud music sometimes in the church, especially if it starts to echo off the walls, can be a little intense. Also, if there's any kind of reverb, I guess with the equipment, if it's a church that, let's say they're using amplifiers for the guitars, that can be a little much. So maybe not doing those things or not having them plugged in so much. An acoustic version, I guess, of the music. Worship guide emailed in advance. That sounds a little bit odd, but with my autism, one of the things I don't like is surprises. I think I've alluded to that before. And so knowing what to expect when I go to any place is something that I like to do. Like if I'm going to go on a trip, I'll map the airport and I'll map exactly what's going to happen on the plane and then what's going to happen when I get there at every step of the way. And so any place where I go someplace new, I tend to get nervous because I don't know what to expect. And so having that expectation set by having some kind of worship guide, I think would be beneficial. Having noise canceling headphones available at the door could be beneficial. I know that generally I've gotten good over the years, as I guess kind of a protective mechanism, is to learn to tune out some of the noise and to somewhat be okay with it. But when I was younger, that wasn't as true. And so having those noise canceling headphones available to folks could be beneficial. And then also maybe having a quiet room somewhere in the church that it was live streaming the service rather than having to sit with the main congregation. That could be beneficial. So I will say that for most of my life, I've gone to church in the building, but in the last few years, I've started to allow myself to basically attend online church, is what I say it. But I attended church. I'll follow the service on YouTube. And so I've discovered that it's a lot better for me, partly because by the end of the week having to work, I don't have a lot of energy left. Like social interaction is difficult for me. And so when I kind of roll into the house, I guess on Friday night, I pretty much feel drained and don't really have the ability, it feels like, to go interact socially with people. And so being able to access church online, real time, has made it a lot better for me because I feel like I can participate fully. I can pay better attention. I'm not overwhelmed by, everything involved. I know sometimes in church it's not just the social aspect. Sometimes it's the loudness of the music or having so many people close by or feeling like I'm not going to go run out of church. But sometimes if things feel overwhelming, knowing that I could walk out is something that I could find comforting. And so when I do the church services at home, having that kind of that release valve is something that's very helpful for me. So again, these accessible services are something that are happening in many different churches around the country. I know when I was kind of looking around for some of the different areas of accessibility, I noticed that autism accessibility specifically was something that a lot of churches are really addressing and thinking about, how they do provide that sensory-friendly environment for folks who have disabilities. So as far as folks who may be deaf or hard of hearing, there are different ways that a church could be hearing accessible. And so a big part of that is having ASL interpreted worship. And so that would be, for example, having interpreters that were there every single Sunday. And then also thinking about where they're positioned. So they're not off to a side where it makes it hard to kind of see what's going on and then to look over and, basically hear what's going on. But have them where they're right there in the action so people can feel like they're getting the entire experience. Also including that ASL interpretation, not just for the church service, but also if you, for example, have Christmas pageants. So that can be helpful. But also then making sure that the people who are on the altar and speaking are also making sure that their faces are visible. A lot of folks, and I think maybe this is more true of people who have lost their hearing over the years, but a lot of folks rely on lip reading and not just ASL interpretation. And so being able to actually see people's mouths when they speak is something that's very important. In order to be, again, accessible to people who maybe are deaf or hard of hearing, then the churches, and not just churches that specialize in helping or catering to deaf congregation, but all churches could make a commitment to being deaf inclusive. So again, some churches are doing this, but not every church. And I will say that I don't know that I have actually seen a lot of ASL in any church, with the exception of sometimes there'll be, this is terrible now that I think about it. In some congregations, there are some folks who have made it a point to learn ASL, and usually they'll share some of that, but it's usually one or two do-gooders in the group. And now that I say that, I need to go make a point of learning ASL. Maybe that'll be one of my New Year's resolutions, so that I can be more inclusive for people too. I think it's a little thing that folks can try to do. I mean, I'm not going to be perfect at it, but to try to be inclusive to folks, I think, is an important thing. So as far as visual accessibility, and again, this is not just for folks who are blind. This is also for low vision or maybe folks who have glasses. So the different things that one could do in the church are bulletins available in larger print or in Braille, or having screen reader friendly PDFs. The other ways that they could be more visual friendly is to have verbal descriptions of visual moments. So, for example, if somebody were to describe in words what was going on, like the sanctuary is lit with soft white lights, or the Advent wreath has 3 purple candles burning. Other things that could be done are high contrast slides, dark backgrounds, light text. This is something that I probably should pay more attention to because my father is actually colorblind. But people don't really think about, for people who are colorblind, how certain images present themselves. And so sometimes the contrast is not very great, or they'll use fonts that aren't very readable. And so it makes it hard for people to, even people who are not low vision or blind, to read along and to see things. This is also a side note, but I've noticed that a lot with businesses, people will use fonts because they must look good when they first pick them out. But when you're driving, it's really hard to actually read what the sign says. And so, again, thinking about the fonts you use and the color choices you make can go a long way towards being visually accessible. And then another thing they could also do is to just not have silent visual moments without narration. Like if you're going to show a slideshow of, different pictures that happen throughout the year, that would be a little bit awkward if you were, again, low vision or blind and didn't really know what was being shown or have any context for it. And maybe you can hear people around you, oohing and aahing or making comments, but it means nothing to you. And so then you would not feel very included or part of the congregation. So I guess the idea of visual accessibility is showing up in some ministries. There are, for example, some Catholic parishes that have a very strong disability ministry. You're also seeing it as a lot of the population gets older. With the baby boomers getting older, then that's becoming more of a need. I know, for example, I don't think of it as being low vision, but over the years, I know, for example, when I was younger, I could read things without magnifying glasses, but now that's getting a little harder to do sometimes to read the fine print. And so it's important for folks to remember, too, it's not necessarily just a disability issue, that it's also an age issue. And then there's also churches that partner with organizations like the Lighthouse for the Blind, who maybe are more thoughtful in how they do visual accessibility. As far as mobility and physical access, so again, everyone knows about the ramp and knows about things like curb cuts. But there are other things that could be done in churches. And I know sometimes churches, if they're older, essentially get grandfathered into not having to make a lot of physical changes in the building to adhere to the ADA laws. But again, it might be something to think about in order to be truly physically accessible. So one of those things might be, for example, having fully step-free chancel access and not just in the pews, where communion, instead of people basically going up to the altar, the communion is brought to people instead. That any pageants, any performances that are staged at the church that are done on accessible platforms. I know when I think about it, I think nearly every single church that I've been in before essentially had steps to go up to the altar. And so that would make it where if you couldn't get on there, if you had physical limitations, and not just being a wheelchair user, if you had trouble navigating steps because maybe you were older or you had an injury, then again, that would make the altar itself inaccessible. And then also think about wheelchair users being included in the actual services of the church. So sometimes folks with disabilities, they'll do things to make the service accessible, but they're not necessarily thinking, oh, well, this person could be a deacon in the church, or they could help with the candle lighting, or they could help, be a part of any performances that we have. So they're keeping these people in mind too. Very often representation is important to people with any kind of disability or maybe any kind of difference. Seeing people who are like them is very inspiring, and it lets them see what's possible. And so making sure that people who are wheelchair users, for example, or have physical access concerns, making sure they're included would be something that would be very beneficial for the church. Ways that folks could be accessible to people with cognitive and intellectual disability includes the language itself that's used in Christmas worship. So trying to speak in plainer language, I know that like with the King James Version growing up, I felt like a lot of it was just like over my head. Like I didn't understand the English they were using or, what the nuance of this was. So maybe, some ways trying to use more modern translations of the Bible that people can understand better. Using short sentences with no idioms. Sometimes I think too, like that's with the autism. A lot of folks with autism tend to take things very literally. That's something that I have an issue with sometimes too. I know over the years I've gotten better about it, mostly because, every idiom I've essentially learned is because at some point I made a horrible mistake and then learned from that mistake. And so, I've had a lot of time now to make a lot of mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. And so I understand those idioms, but again, everyone may not have had as much time as I've had to learn from their mistakes. And so keeping things in shorter sentences and not using idioms would be beneficial. To have a main idea and to be very cohesive about it and to repeat it. I've often heard that if you have to say something 3 times for people to really have it sink in. And so making sure that, again, you're being very cohesive in the message and that you're repeating it enough so that it does sink in with people. Having visual supports like a PowerPoint presentation or something that's basically also reinforcing what is being spoken can be beneficial. Sometimes too, I know, at least with my autism, if I see something written, it sticks in my head. And if I write something physically, then I remember it. But sometimes when people are talking to me, it feels a little bit like in Charlie Brown when the teacher was talking with the wah, 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 wah. Like I just don't, it's hard for me to pick up everything that's said to me sometimes. Like I have to really focus and concentrate and try not to get distracted in order for me to get all the points. So if I could see a written PowerPoint, that would be beneficial. And so again, I don't think I'm probably the only one who benefit from that. So having multiple methods in order to, again, relay your message, and then have different ways that participation is encouraged. So sometimes that can be movement or objects or repetition, instead of just basically a lecture like in college where you sit there and someone talks at you. Incorporating different methods into the worship can be beneficial and get people involved. I will say too, and this was interesting to me, is someone has said that just in general, people's attention span has diminished so much because of social media that, you lose them very quickly. And so by having these different methods of reaching people, I think you're more likely to keep them engaged and keep them understanding, get your message than you would be if you just tried boring lecture, which again, you're not going to church to be entertained, but it doesn't hurt. And it also, I think finding joy in the worship of God is a good thing. So one final way churches can be accessible, have disabled people play a role in the ministry. So that can be things like being a pastor or a worship leader. It gives them an opportunity, again, to show visually that folks with disabilities can do these things, but also they'll have a different awareness of some of the accessibility needs where they could plan things out from the beginning, where instead of being almost an afterthought, it's a very intentional entire exercise in how to make the church accessible. And these people, again, can share theology that is shaped by their lived experience and not by telling stories of somebody else's experience. So just in general, though, kind of as a bit of a wrap up, remember that accessibility isn't a program. It's a posture that the church essentially has to take, or should take, I think, in order to truly, truly open the church up to all members of the congregation and to all people, to make sure, again, that they're being as Christ-like as they could be. So in conclusion, when we create accessible spaces, we are praising God with our architecture, our art, and our hospitality. Every widened doorway, every sign interpreter, every sensory-friendly service, it's a hymn of welcome. At the heart of Christmas is not grandeur, it's simplicity, not perfection, but presence. The God of the universe chose to enter our world through a body that needed care, through a family that faced exclusion, into a place that was small and imperfect, and called it good enough. Accessibility is not about lowering expectations, it's about lifting love higher. It's how we turn no room in the inn into welcome home. At Christmas, we remember that God did not wait for us to reach heaven. God came down to us to make divine love accessible. Thank you for joining me today. If today's conversation moved you, I invite you to reflect on how you can make your own physical and spiritual spaces more welcoming this season. I would also invite you to think about the people in your lives this year who may need some extra care and making sure that you reach out to them as well. So I'll be back in a month with our next episode. So January is my birthday month, so I thought I would talk about one of my favorite things in the world, dogs, and how they show up in the Bible and how they serve humans. So until next time, may your heart be open, your table wide, and your Christmas filled with the light of inclusion. And remember that every time you make room for someone else, you're remaking the manger. Goodbye for now and Merry Christmas. Paul's Thorn, Episode 15, copyright 2025 by Angeli Vincent, all rights reserved.